Chapter 22, Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie was born in a stone cottage in Dunfermline, Scotland in 1835. His father was a weaver who worked at a hand loom, but when the Industrial Revolution came to Scotland, Andrew's father could find no work. Power looms produced cloth faster and cheaper than artisans or hand workers could. Many weavers lost their jobs. They were angry at the government and the business leaders, but there was nothing they could do about it. Poor workers weren't even allowed to vote. In the little town of Dunfermline, workers were determined to gain the right to vote and to strike. Andrew Carnegie's dad was one of those who spoke out for workers' right. You might call him an idealist. He wanted to make the world better. Andrew's mother was a realist. She was the practical one. She worried about putting food on the table for her family. When there was no money, she stitched shoes and sold groceries. She was the one who sold the family's few belongings and decided that they should fill out of Scotland and head for America. Andrew Carnegie had those two sides to him. His mother's side made him sensible and willing to work hard. His father's side made him want to improve the world. There was another important influence on Carnegie. It was his Uncle George. George Lauder loved poetry, and he read the words of Robert Burns and William Shakespeare to his nephew. When Carnegie got to be rich, very, very rich, he could still recite Shakespeare. He had great writers and thinkers as friends, and Carnegie could talk with them in ways his fellow millionaires would have never understood. But while he was getting rich, he didn't seem to worry much about the working people who were laboring for him. He forgot his father's troubles. What he did do was work hard himself, use his imagination and intelligence, and take every chance that came his way. In his first job in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, was a bobbin boy in a textile factory. He worked from 6 in the morning until 6 at night and was paid $1.20 a day. He was 12 years old. A year later, he heard that a messenger boy was needed at the new telegraph office in Pittsburgh. He got the job and set out to be the best messenger boy in town. Soon he knew all the streets and buildings by heart. He watched the telegraph operators and taught himself Morse code. Then he learned to decipher the code from the clicking sound of the telegraph without needing the tape printer. No one else in Pittsburgh could do that. One day, Andy found a check for $500 on the street. He turned it over to those who could find the owner. A newspaper, the Pittsburgh Gazette, wrote a story about him. It called him an honest little fellow. And that impressed Thomas A. Scott, who was soon to become a leading railroad man. He hired Carnegie as an assistant at $35 a month. Andy was now 17 and in a place where opportunity would find him. When it did, he was ready to grab it. He learned about capital, which is money, and how to use it to get businesses started. He learned to put money to work. He invested in railroads, railroad sleeping cars, bridges, and oil derricks. By the time he was 33, he was rich. Then he wrote himself a note. So far, it was his mother's side he had followed. At 33, he remembered his father's idealism. He wrote that he would work for money for 2 more years. Then he would work to help others. No idol is more debasing than the worship of money, wrote Carnegie. 2 years later, he must have forgotten that note, or maybe the lure of money was too strong. He kept working hard and getting richer and richer. He entered the iron business, but soon realized that steel was the metal of the future. Carnegie became king of America's steel industry, and soon American steel dominated the world. The Carnegie Steel Company was very profitable. It used the best, most efficient machinery and kept wages very low. Carnegie's workers, men who were like his dad and uncle, earned very little. Life for their families was awful. The writer Hamlin Garland visited a steel town and wrote this: "The streets were horrible, the buildings poor, the sidewalks sunken and full of holes. Everywhere the yellow mud of the streets lay kneaded into the sticky masses through which groups of people of pale, lean men, slouched in faded garments. When salaries were cut at Carnegie's Homestead Steel Mill in Pennsylvania, the workers went on strike. Carnegie's manager, Henry Clay Frick, refused to talk to the strikers. Instead, he sent in Pinkerton detectives. Pinkerton was the name of a company who supplied armed guards. They were called detectives, but they were just men with guns. 20 strikers were killed. So were 4 detectives. Andrew Carnegie was vacationing in Scotland. Had he forgotten his origins? If you saw the way he lived, you would say so. He owned a castle in Scotland and houses in America that seemed like palaces. He lived like a prince, while many who worked for him lived like paupers. Then the most successful banker in America, J. Pierpont Morgan, offered to buy Carnegie out. It was 1901, 9 years after the Homestead strike, and Carnegie was 66. It was an opportunity that might never come again. The sale would make him one of the richest men in the world. At first he hesitated. Perhaps he didn't know what he would do with himself if he was no longer running a business empire. Then he may have remembered the note he wrote when he was 33. Or maybe he remembered his father's ideals. He sold his business interests and began a new career. It was the business of giving away his money. When you're as rich as Andrew Carnegie, that is a big job, especially if you want to do it well, which he did. He wrote that the man who dies thus rich dies disgraced. He said that millionaires had a duty to distribute their wealth while they were still alive. He didn't want to be disgraced. And he didn't. He didn't want to die disgraced, and he didn't. He began by building libraries in towns all across the country, 3,000 of them, costing nearly $60 million. He gave money to colleges and schools and artists and writers, and to an institute to promote peace, and to another to improve teaching, and to another that was to attempt to make the world better. He gave away almost all of his riches. Not long before he died, he turned to his private secretary and asked, "How much did you say I've given away, Poynton?" $324,657,399 came the answer. "Good heavens," said Carnegie, "where did I even get all that money?" Andrew Carnegie provided the money for one of the world's finest concert halls, Carnegie Hall in New York. Here's an old joke about it. A young woman steps on an older woman in New York Street and says, "Excuse me, sir, how do I get to Carnegie Hall?" He replies, "Practice, practice, practice." You may read the How Do You Make Steel section on your own. Just pause the video.